Check, 1, 2, check, check.
One more time, please, if you don't mind.
Yeah, check, 1, 2, 1, 2.
On mic. Looks like I get both channels, so you get both.
Mic check, check. Mic check, okay.
Worked. Well, good morning and thank you all for being here. Today is veto day, and I think they're very shortly going to adjourn sine die, and marks the end of our 100th legislative session. So it's been a historic session in many ways, and I want to say thank you to the people of South Dakota for the opportunity to serve as governor. It's been quite an experience. Especially becoming governor in the middle of session was not without its challenges, and I'd say also opportunities. For the last couple of weeks, we've been doing our Open for Opportunities tour, and that has really been encouraging to me, and I've enjoyed it immensely, getting around the state and visiting folks and businesses that I didn't know existed. And so I would say, you know, we're planning the next few weeks, already starting to plan more tours. And if you have ideas for us, be sure and let us know. I am all ears when it comes to ideas of where to go and what might be unique to visit. Wanted to talk today about the property tax proposal that we mentioned the last week of regular session. We had come up with a concept kind of late in session that week for a tax cut proposal. Obviously, we had passed Senate Bill 216, which was basically a stopgap to stop the bleeding, if you will. And we talked about that in the context that we still needed to find more meaningful tax cuts. It was suggested when we brought up the concept to maybe find a vehicle and do that the last week of session. I didn't want to do that. We've seen those types of issues come up and you rush things through that late in the session. You really don't honor the process and the intent of good law as far as going through committee hearings and be able to vet it through the legislative process. At the same time, they'd formed a task force. So we opted with the idea of putting the proposal together, getting some of the kinks ironed out, if you will, look at the data and come up with a better idea of a direction to move forward. And so we're going to lay that out for you today. We met with leadership, Republican leadership last night, talked to the Senate caucus today to brief them about this proposal that they were going to offer to their property tax task force. As was mentioned in the last week, what we're proposing today, we're calling it the Homeowners Tax Relief Program. What it represents is a half-penny sales tax local option for local governments. Each county would have the option to implement a sales tax of up to 0.5%, and all the proceeds would go directly to owner-occupied tax relief. Understanding that if once the owner-occupied tax in that county is totally erased, then any additional revenue would go to offset taxes on the other classes of property. And that's part of what took us some time to discern, was putting the data together on what a 1%, we started out at 1%. When we put the data sheets together, in some cases, that was substantially more than what the total proceeds that they got from the county mill levy. And that's what we're talking about. On the property taxes, there's several mill levies, including the city mill levy, the county mill levy for education, and this half-cent would go directly to offset the county mill levy for owner-occupied property taxes. A few of the other details, it would be referable to a vote. It would be implemented by ordinance from the county commissioners. It would be referable to put it to a vote, and also it could be initiated. Since there really isn't, when we originally talked about the concept, there was conversation about the counties that might, with a 1%, there would be additional revenue, and giving the county commissioners the ability to use that for other spending. Didn't like that idea because we wanted to make sure this was 100% property tax relief. So the half-cent would go directly to the owner-occupied. A number of counties, I was looking at the spreadsheet, I think considerably more than half the counties, that half-cent would represent more than 100% of their property tax on the county mill levy. Again, I think the counties that we focused on, understanding that once again, I wanted to take more of a rifle shot approach. We had, I think, over 20 pieces of legislation dealing with property tax relief. In my view, the problem with most of those bills, they were proposing a statewide solution to a 5-county problem. And with this bill, the local option, it's totally up to the counties. I believe there'll be more than the 5 counties that this will be a good fit for them, but they have that option. And if the county commissioners don't bring that option forward and the people want it, they can initiate bringing it forward. I have Jim Terwilliger, our BFM commissioner, with me today, and also Michael Howdyshell. He's the Secretary of the Department of Revenue, and so they can fill in any gaps that I'm missing. I think that's most of the details. The task force is being formed. Jim will be on that task force the way the statute is written. I've designated Kirk Chafee to be my designee on that committee, and so I look forward to them working on this. The other thing I would mention from a practical standpoint, we all know there's 3 ways that you can provide property tax relief. We've talked about that in the last press conference. The first option is a tax shift. There was absolutely no desire to do that, nor should there be. It doesn't help the situation much. Second option is to cut spending. And the third option, which this represents, is a new revenue stream. I will say one of the benefits to this, and especially in the counties that are most impacted the most in the state, are areas where tourism is pretty prevalent. And so this represents allowing us to offset property taxes with out-of-state sales tax dollars. Visitors to our state that are visiting our Black Hills or in the southeast state, part of the state, would allow them to harvest out-of-state sales tax dollars to offset property tax dollars. Those are a few of the high points of this legislation. Anything to add to that I missed, gentlemen? Tony Van Huysen will be there. I think they're in the process of getting their heads together so they can adjourn sine die, but he'll be down later on as well to join us. With that, I would open it up for questions.
Thanks, Governor. Jonathan Ellis with the Dakota Scout. Just so I understand, you mentioned this is the county mill. Can a city vote on this? We're telling local governments, or are these just county votes?
This would be county governor, a county option, would be the county commissioners.
And the bulk of property taxes go to schools, my understanding. Does that apply? Would it just be used for the county portion of 20-some%, or?
It would be just the county mill levy. There's a county mill levy, you have a municipal mill levy, you have special ed, there's a number of different mill levies. The main ones are education, counties, and cities.
Thank you.
I had to, we put together some of the information I might even just share with you. We peeled out a couple of the bigger examples, Minnehaha County and Pennington County as two cases. For Pennington County, a $325,000 home would realize at a half a percent increase in sales tax, would realize a $917 a year savings. That is a projected savings of 22% of their tax bill on that house. A Minnehaha, pretty similar, $325,000 home would recognize a $967 savings, which is 21% of the taxes on that home.
Governor Blake Trolley, Dakota Territory News. You said you had a meeting with leadership last night. How did that meeting go? How was this proposal received?
I thought it was. I thought it was received pretty well. There was a lot of positive remarks afterwards, and people that thought it was certainly worth the conversation. I got a sense that there was kind of a sense of relief. And I understand that. I've been in their shoes for 16 years. You organize a task force, and I've led task force or summer study committees, and you find yourself, at a loss for coming up with a starting point. And I think it was kind of a relief to some of the legislators that I talked to that they had something they could run with right off the bat to address and have serious discussions, so they're not floundering through the summer trying to come up with a concept that they can get behind.
Grant Green with Dakota News. Now, I noticed that, this option is for like a 5-year term. Is there any chance that, with the state sales tax that's going to be sunset in 2027, that some of that money that comes back to the state when it sunsets, that could be used to be put into this property tax reduction fund?
Well, I'm not certain that I totally understand your question, but I'll say this: everything's on the table at that point. They have an option to continue if they've opted into this program. That county, they continue. If the sales tax goes back is frozen or goes back up, they have the option to get back out of the property tax relief program.
Governor, I have two questions. One is I'm going to take you back to the news conference you did with us a few weeks ago. I thought I heard you say that you did not support a county sales tax. Did I misinterpret what you said that day?
Well, you might be referring to the half-cent sales tax reduction statewide for property tax reduction that was introduced. It was one of the 20 pieces of legislation that was considered. Is that right?
I don't know.
Yes. Well, that was one of the big proposals that was suggested that I did oppose. Again, that was a classic example of a statewide fix to a very localized problem. Whereas this is a county option, and 100% of those dollars go toward property tax relief in the counties that choose to adopt this program.
We'll go to the phones for a few questions quick.
Yeah, Lee Schubinger with SDPB. Can you hear me?
Not very good.
Oh, I'll try and get closer.
There we go.
I was just wondering, real quick. I had a couple questions. One, would this allow for kind of tourism season flexibility, so like counties could turn it on, between Memorial Day and Labor Day? Is that an idea that might be included in this?
Everything's on the table. I had thought about that. It wasn't part of the proposal we laid out, but just in my own private thoughts, I kind of had thought along the same lines that just we've done taxes like that in the past where it's just in effect during the tourism hours, and I don't know if that's a viable option or not, but it would be on the table for the task force if they wanted to go down that path.
And then I guess one more, maybe kind of like historical question. Has there been any reason why counties haven't been able to collect sales tax in the past, or is just kind of one of those governmental entities that have just kind of maybe fallen through the cracks on being able to capture that?
I believe there, in my time in the legislature, I seem to remember several attempts at allowing counties taxing authority on sales tax. I would say that it was met with not very much support. That's why the property tax system was set up in the first place, was to be the funding source for our counties.
We'll go back to the rooms quick.
And Governor, then Bob Mercer from Kellerland again. So just to follow up then, and you haven't decided yet whether you're going to run for re-election or whether you're going to run for election, but is the idea of a tax increase on one hand going to affect that decision at all? I mean, what's the greater evil here, property taxes or sales taxes?
Well, it's not a tax increase. It is supplanting property tax dollars with a sales tax at the option of the local governments, their choice. In fact, I would realistically, it's a tax decrease for citizens of the state of South Dakota because of the factor that out-of-state tourists that are spending dollars in South Dakota are helping offset some of that cost of property tax.
Governor Grant Green with Dakota News Now. I know when I spoke to Mr. Van Huysen about his bill that was going to just quickly remove that sunset on the state sales tax, there was, of course, many people worried about that increase and how it affects low-income Americans. Like, they're not going to be the ones benefiting off of a property tax cut, but they will be affected by a sales tax. Again, to ask this question, again, if the counties, they implement this 0.5% sales tax, is there any concern about what that does maybe to these low-income Americans when their grocery bills are higher?
Well, certainly there's concern, and that would be considered by the local governments and the people of that county, whether or not they support that program, given their circumstances. Every county has a different set of circumstances.
I am curious about timeline, just because if this does go through, then there would be that additional action needed by the counties to get this through. Are you looking at any options to get this done before the next legislative session?
Not really. The task force will work through the interim, and like I said, there was some conversations about trying to get it done at the very tail end of session, because that's It was to that point before we even come up with the concept. But I've not given any thought about if you're suggesting a special session or anything like that. I've not had any input on that side of it. Or people that are wanting me to do that.
Governor, just so I'm clear on this, so if a Minnehaha County Commission were to pass this, this would apply to the home rule, like residents of the city of Sioux Falls?
Yes, and I think, I don't know, maybe I'm speculating the nature of your question, but Minnehaha and Lincoln County are in a unique set of circumstances. And there may well be a need in this legislation to allow some cooperative effort in a situation like Minnehaha with Sioux Falls spreading into two different counties. There might have to be some allowance for mutual agreements or whatever between counties in that case.
We have time for 2 more questions here.
Throw one in. Governor, you have done a pretty good job, it seems like, of taking both ends of the Republican Party and representing the two of them. You know, you're signing gun legislation with Voida and others who have been seen as kind of, you know, on a, I don't know what, they describe themselves probably as more anti-establishment or something along those lines. How do you know, is that something you're consciously making an effort toward? And how are you feeling because of, you know, where you're at about, you know, if you were to run in the future, do you feel like you're in a good spot right now?
Well, I feel like I feel like we had a good session, you know, given the cards that we were dealt and trying to do a transition. And so I've been very encouraged by, you know, a lot of the conversations, and it was, to me, kind of a confirmation of some of the things that I addressed in my original inaugural address. And it really felt like, you know, I try to lead by example, and working across the aisles and working within the caucuses. I think it was pretty well received. I think I'm pretty effective at communicating with all spectrums. And I think that's, you know, life is about relationships, and politics is a game of addition. And I understand that pretty well, and I try to reflect that in the things I say and the way I relate to people. So, yeah, it's been encouraging, and I've been pleased with the working relationships I see between my office and all 4 caucuses in the Capitol.
On Friday, I know you signed the budget, the fiscal year 2026 budget, into law. What do you make of that budget? What do you think the biggest wins of that budget were? Were there any things that you would have liked to see happen differently?
Well, yeah, certainly there are a few things that I would have changed in the budget. But all in all, I think the biggest thing that we take for granted and lose focus on is it was the 136th balanced budget for our state. And we had pretty unique situations that we worked past, and they got the budget out 24 hours earlier than I've ever seen it get out before, 2 days ahead of the final day of session. And that's pretty remarkable. And there were cuts that were restored. There was, at the end of the day, there was still over $70 million in cuts that came from my agencies proposed in our budget. The Nome-Roden budget was proposed, and a number of restorations that took place. I think we made $80 million of cuts. The legislature restored roughly $7 million of those cuts. So all in all, very good budget, and we got it done on time.
Great. Thank you all for your questions, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you all.
amount of moisture from the earth. They're conduits for water. In Arizona and New Mexico, water is everything. On the kilt, these vertical lines represent rain. These step devices represent clouds. This Katsina